and welcome to video 2 of module 4. This video is entitled Why You Feel Loved, and it's the second part of the interpersonal attachment module that sort of talks about all of the different theories, explaining why it is that you feel, well, essentially why it is you are the way you are based on certain models that your family went through. And I'll say again the same thing that I said in the last video, which is when we talk about family, we are talking about lots of different types of things, but technically we're talking about your family of origin, and not everyone's family of origin looks the same, and we'll talk about that today when we talk about your attachment figure doesn't necessarily have to have been a parent. And two, that just because you have these modules to label sort of things that happen to you or different dynamics that you grew up seeing, that doesn't mean that it explains away your behavior now or that you don't have the option to change them. I mean, many of the dynamics that are on this sheet are things that 10 years ago I thought were inevitable, and I didn't even notice that I was doing them. And now I have different dynamics than I did before I delved into this material. So it is absolutely possible, if the dynamic that you have isn't the one that you want, if not to change your family of origin, because you can't change other people, at least to put new dynamics into play so that you attract different people, so that the people that you're spending time with now run on a different dynamic. All right, so the first theory that we're going to discuss in this video, and this one's shorter than the last one, so I will try to go quickly because I know sometimes these get a little long, is called parental or interpersonal exception rejection theory. So it used to be called parental acceptance rejection theory, or PAR theory. And then, because it's sort of not really just about your parents, it's about any significant attachment figure, it got changed to interpersonal theory. Interpersonal acceptance rejection theory, or IPAR theory. So sometimes I will accidentally call it PAR theory because I forget that it had kind of a name change. Also, the name change hasn't really caught on. But it's important because not everyone is thinking of this model primarily through a biological parent. All right. So IPAR or PAR theory. So the theory states that when you perceive yourself to have been rejected by your dominant attachment figure, at any point in life. So that could be when you were a little baby. Like, for example, if you grew up not knowing your biological father, or having another like significant attachment figure in your life who wasn't present, and you perceive that rejection, you perceive that lack of presence as them rejecting you, that can happen without you having even ever met them. But of course, you can also have a parent who withdraws later in life, or even in adulthood sometimes you can be dealing with the rejection by an attachment figure. So at any point in life, the perceived rejection of an attachment figure tends to be associated with the same cluster of personality dispositions found among children and adults rejected by parents in childhood. So in other words, people who have this perceived sense of rejection, whether you're children or adults, whether it happened in childhood or in adulthood, they tend to come up with the same kinds of characteristics in their adult life. Okay, so the basic tenet of the theory is that we are going to develop our sense of self in response to how available our most significant caregiver has been. So how emotionally available has our most significant caregiver been, right? That's how we develop our sense of self. And what if you have a lot of caregivers? And what if each caregiver was sort of like available to different degrees? So for me, as you're trying to think about this theory, especially if you had multiple attachment figures in your life, maybe you were raised by like parents who weren't always in the picture, or grandparents, or a significant aunt or cousin, or maybe you were in foster care. It's going to be the attachment figure who was the least available to you, but in a problematic way. So it's going to be the attachment figure that you most strongly wanted to be available and was not. So for some of us, for example, we may have had a caregiver who wasn't available to us, emotionally available. Maybe they were never in the picture, and we just didn't care, right? So for some of us, for example, it wouldn't have mattered to me if my grandparents were not in the picture. They were like, I think, the normal amount of grandparent time, but if they hadn't, it wouldn't have bothered me. But first, oh no, what happened? Sorry, my phone started. But if, sorry, my phone started. But if you grew up now with your grandparent being a significant caregiver, the idea that they would have emotionally been unavailable to you when you were younger would have been really problematic, right? So it's the person whom you most want to identify with and have them be available to you, who withdraws their care, either intentionally or unintentionally, that is going to be the attachment figure that you're going to want to think about. And again, this was always a perception thing. So your attachment figure could have died in war service. They could have been locked up against, unfairly by an unjust legal system. They could have had to travel abroad a lot for work so that they could pay for you to go to a fancy school. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why your caregiver that you're thinking of in this model wouldn't have been available to you the way you would have liked. It's your perception that is rejection that's the issue. This is why it's really important for divorced people or people who co-parent a child, but actually not even co-parent. This is why it's really important for any person who raises a child and that child's other significant caregivers are not in the picture to be very guarded about their language, because you want to do everything you can to control the sense from the child that the significant caregiver has abandoned them. And so saying things like, oh, well, your father left us kind of thing is like something you don't want to say to children, because again, that perception that they've withdrawn or left them creates a lot of personality characteristics in life that maybe are going to create more difficulty for them overcoming them than they would if they had more secure attachment. All right. So when we're thinking about attachment figure, think about the person in your life who has been most influential to you by being the least available. So for me, that's definitely my dad. He has most influenced my character traits, often my negative character traits, by not being emotionally available. So that could be a biological parent who was never present in our life. And for others, it could be biological parents who weren't available in the way they would have liked. It could be a grandparent. Like I said, it could be foster family. So whoever your attachment figure is. All right. What happens with your attachment figure is that when the attachment figure is not available, and then your little child brain or even your adult brain chooses to interpret that lack of availability as they rejected me, they left me, or you perceive their availability as they've accepted me, right? They are here for me. You develop a sense of personality characteristics. And those personality characteristics are dependence and independence, and then acceptance and rejection. So I'm just going to kind of go through these, and I put a little chart in your study guide to kind of help you. So IPAR theory looks at two different dimensions of your relationship to your attachment figure. There's the warmth dimension and the dependence dimension. So on one axis is the warmth, and on the other axis is dependence. I like my models, my 4-square models. Okay. The warmth dimension has to do with the quality of the affectional bond between you and your attachment figure, and the physical, verbal, and symbolic behaviors your attachment figures use to express those feelings. On one end of the continuum is acceptance. That's warmth, strong senses of affection, care, comfort, concern, nurturance, support, or these things we call love, right? That we do or do not experience from our attachment figures or caregivers. The other end of the continuum is marked by rejection, and that's obviously the opposite. That's the absence of significant withdrawal of these feelings and behaviors. Sometimes the presence of a variety of physically and psychologically hurtful behaviors and effects. But again, you can perceive rejection from someone who isn't even in your life, depending on how you think about that person and how other people in your life help you think about that person. So there doesn't need to necessarily be the presence of physical or verbal abuse. Unfortunately, though, a lot of times your attachment figure may have engaged in those kinds of behaviors. So you've got warmth, which is rejection versus acceptance. So and then there's the second axis, dependence. So dependence, like warmth, is also construed kind of as a continuum, with independence on one side and dependence on the other side. And we know, of course, from relational dialectic theories that these are more like tensions. Dependence, independence, dependence, independence. Those are more like tensions, like acceptance, rejection. We're never in a relationship, I don't think, where everyone just accepts us. There's always going to be some withdrawal of care, even if it's just, like, for example, if and this happens a lot with like really tired working parents, and they're like, oh, I'm tired. I have all these kids I have to take care of. I don't have any help. And I've worked a really long day, and I really want to just sit alone for 20 minutes and like catch my breath while the kids are, I don't know, watching TV in the living room, but they want my attention. And I'm afraid that if I take time out for myself, then my kids are going to think I'm not there for them. And that's true. Like if you grow up with a mom and periodically the mom's like, or the dad, or the, again, grandparent, whatever, is like, hey, I need half an hour to myself. You could perceive that as rejection because it's a perception thing. And that's why it's really important, I think, for people to explain the logic behind what they're doing. so that kids have a chance to reconcile the behavior rather than just going into their little brains and saying like, oh, that must mean that I'm a bother, or that must mean that they don't love me, kind of thing. But it is a dialectic because you're going to have to reject and accept at different points. It's more like which side of the continuum you maybe fall on more often that determines this outcome, because no family is going to be like 100% acceptance all the time. All right, so highly dependent people are those who have a frequent and intense desire for positive response. So like they frequently need affirmation, pay attention to me, let me know I matter, right? Because they're not getting those kinds of things voluntarily. And they're likely to make many, many bids for response, meaning they're likely to do a lot of things that are going to get somebody to pay attention to them. These are people for whom differentiation from their attachment figure was an unpleasant or stressful experience. And likely there's like very few boundaries between the attachment figure and the highly dependent person, because the attachment figure probably wasn't good at helping to create separation between themselves and the child. So highly dependent people can look like people pleasers, right? Oh, please, please let me do whatever you want so you'll love me. Or they can look like constantly acting out, constantly misbehaving, because either way they get the response. So whether I'm doing everything you want me to do, like cleaning the house 24/7, and that maybe makes you, if not show me affection, at least you recognize my value, right? You're like at least you don't get mad, for example, if the house is clean. Versus I could come home and just like throw shit everywhere and throw a tantrum, because you're still going to pay attention to me. And yes, you might be paying attention to me because it's negative, but it's still attention. So as a child, and sometimes I think even as an adult, when the person who is significant to you, that you care about, that you want to approve of you, withdraws care, you perceive that they withdraw care, you perceive that they're rejecting you, you perceive that you don't know where you start and they begin, right? Because they haven't helped you develop a sense of you being able to do things on your own while them still supporting you but not being the same person. Whether you act out positively or negatively, either one of them gets that person to pay attention to you. And unfortunately for a lot of us, when we behaved, our attachment figure would just ignore us, because why would they pay attention to us? They could just go and do their own thing. But when we misbehaved, that's when the attachment figure would pay attention to us. And so we learned that misbehavior gets us the response that we want. It seems counterintuitive because we're getting a negative response, like we're being yelled at, we're being disciplined. But if it's between a negative response where we're being yelled at and disciplined, or no response, we'll choose the negative response, because at least it's some kind of a response. So highly dependent people have frequent and intense desire for positive response. And by positive, they just mean like a noticeable response. Yes, I would like it to be positive, but I'll take negative if that's what I can get. And they're likely to make many bids for response. And they're people also for whom differentiation from their attachment figure was an unpleasant or stressful experience. So they don't feel comfortable being left alone to be autonomous, because to them that feels like rejection. Then on the other hand are highly independent people. And highly independent people are those who have their need for positive response met sufficiently so that they are free from frequent or intense yearning or behavioral bids for attention from significant others, right? So these are people that don't need to get a rise out of other people to feel appreciated. And that's because they probably had a family of origin that was good at setting up boundaries, explaining why the boundaries were there, reinforcing the boundaries, and also making it safe for you to be independent and not feel like you needed the approval of other people in order to be successful. Also, highly independent people see themselves as separate from their attachment figure. They see themselves as differentiated, but not like in a rejected way. They just feel comfortably like I am me and they are them. And yes, we communicate and we get along and they're there for me and they can comfort me and they can support me. But I ultimately am not the same as my family of origin. And I'm trying to think of an example. So if you've ever heard someone say like you live vicariously through your children, that means that as a parent, you never got to be captain of the football team. And so now you're obsessed with your kid becoming a football player. So if anyone's ever seen Cinderella Story with Hilary Duff, I know it's kind of old now. I don't know if you've still seen it, but and the lead guy really wants to be a writer, but the dad's obsessed with him being a football player. That's poor differentiation, right? So me as a parent trying to get my kid to live the life that I wanted to live, that I think is the best life for them, that's poor differentiation. Just like if you have parents who come to you on the weekends at college to make sure that you're doing your homework, or they call in every day and nag you about your grades, or they like insist on sitting in office hours to make, that's poor differentiation. They're not setting a boundary between themselves and you. And I'm sure you've felt the negative effects of poor differentiation, because when you can't get a strong sense of where your self stops and your family of origin self begins, if it just feels like you and your family of origin all share a sense of self, it's very uncomfortable, and it doesn't allow you to take responsibility for your behavior. So you're always essentially doing what they think you should do, even though you know it doesn't feel right, but you have no way of knowing what it is that you want to do because you're not differentiated. So highly independent people are differentiated, and they have a strong sense that they'll be fine on their own, and that they have the capacity to make their own decisions. Now, we need to distinguish true independence, which is feeling secure in your separation from others, from defensive independence, which looks like healthy independence in that individuals make relatively few behavioral bids for response. But unlike healthy independence, defensive independence continue to kind of crave that warmth and support, that positive response, although they sometimes don't recognize it. Indeed, because often there's like an overlay of anger and distrust and other negative emotions generated by chronic rejection. These people don't often positively deny this need. So it's kind of like this, to hell with you, I don't need you, I don't need anybody. That's just another way of expressing dependence, right? So there's people-pleasing dependence, and then there is people rejecting dependence. They're both symptoms that when you were younger or into your adolescence primarily, or maybe even in a significant adult relationship, somebody or several somebodies who were your attachment figures, people that you depended on, could be could be a teacher that you've had for the last 4 years, could be a guidance counselor in high school. I mean, all these things, that these people that you depend on to provide warmth and support for you and acceptance and help you understand who you are as an individual separate from other people, that they have not done their job. And so that creates dependence in you, because since you didn't get what you needed and you didn't learn to wrap your mind around it, you just keep wanting it, right? You haven't yet gotten to a place where it's like, for example, like I, as a person with healthy independence, when my father or a significant other in my life is like having a bad day and they just can't do for me what I would like them to do in terms of emotional care and paying attention to me and listening to my accomplishments and asking about my day, I don't try to people please to make them feel better, and I don't get mad and I'm like, fuck you, right? I just don't care, because it's not somebody else's job to make me feel better about myself. Like if I want to feel good about myself and I want to make decisions and I want to have a healthy relationship to myself, then that's on me, and I don't need other people to do that work for me. That was not how I felt as a child. As a child, I was highly dependent, very much people-pleasing, very much trying to do things so that no one in my house would get angry, very much trying to control the situation around me so that I could prevent negative response from my attachment figure. My brother was the opposite, and we were separated for several years while we had to live in different homes, but he's a defensive independent. He's very quick to anger, very quick to fuck you, very quick to I don't need this, very quick to I'll do it on my own, but that doesn't come from a place of true independence. It comes from a place of that's how he has learned to cope with not feeling like he has strong sense of self, strong sense of differentiation, strong sense of autonomy, right? And we had a pretty, I mean, I'll say in the grand scheme of things, I would say that our upbringing, we had a lot of opportunities to become independent people who had adequate amounts of warmth. This is exacerbated in situations where people either had no warmth or no opportunity to develop independence. So for example, if you grew up with a parent who was an addict, which I did, who suffered from depression, who had bipolarism, who chronic pain, for some reason or another was so preoccupied with what was going on with them that they couldn't be available to you. Or if you're in a relationship now with a partner who's like that, you have to work a lot harder to develop that independence and that warmth because your attachment figure is not doing that for you. And that to me is the greatest thing about being an adult, because a lot of people like miss their childhoods. I don't miss childhood, because childhood was all about me having to develop myself in response to other people's negative shit. And now as an adult, I get to recognize, oh, your negative shit is your negative shit, and I can choose how I want to behave. And that's really what I love about this model. It helps explain why my family of origin operated, and it gives me labels for things that happened and explanations for certain behaviors I have. But it also teaches me that if I want different outcomes, I just have to behave differently, right? And instead of perceiving that my attachment figure rejected me, I've had to do a lot of work perceiving that I'm fine and my attachment figure just did the best they could, but ultimately, like, they probably shouldn't have been a parent. But that's not my fault. That's just how it worked out. So I've had to do a lot of work on that so I can have true independence instead of dependence or codependence, which is what I had, which is a lot of my behavior growing up. Okay, so that leads us to the second part of the video. So we had the IPART theory, interpersonal acceptance rejection theory. We've got the warmth dimension, which is about acceptance rejection. And then we've got the dependence dimension, which is to what degree are you dependent or differentiated from your attachment figure, and your independence dependence, which is the degree to which you've then developed as an independent adult. So you can look that over because this is going to correlate very much to our next model, because this is kind of the basis for the next model. And the next model is your theory of attachment styles. So these, again, we have a 4-square model, and the theory of attachment styles directly relates to IPART theory. It's just another way of thinking it, and I like both of them because one is about kind of the underlying dynamics and the other one is about the personality types that you develop as a result. And again, these personality types may describe behaviors you've done up to this point, but they do not explain away bad behavior that you're not benefiting from, and they also are not inevitable. You can change your attachment style. So what I don't want you to do is find out that you're like a dismissive attachment style and then go around like, oh, well, I don't have to change my behavior because I just have a dismissive attachment style. It's not like a hard and fast thing, right? It's a label that randomly I've taught you that may or may not feel right, but you don't want to use it as an excuse to explain why you do stuff. Telling me you have a dismissive attachment style and that's why you don't do stuff is like telling me the reason you don't do stuff is that you're a procrastinator. You don't not do stuff because you're a procrastinator. You don't do stuff and that's what makes you a procrastinator. The reason you don't do stuff is something far different, right? And part of you calling yourself a procrastinator is that you don't have to think about why it is you're not doing the thing that you've ostensibly decided you should do or want to do or need to do, right? Same thing with attachment styles. You telling me you're a dismissive attachment style isn't an explanation for why you're not addressing my needs in a relationship in an equitable way. You not addressing my needs in an equitable way is what makes you dismissive, but it doesn't explain away that behavior. All right, so again, we got the 2 axes, the 4 models. On the one axis is your anxiety of abandonment. So how nervous you are that people are going to leave or disappoint you. So this is your kind of like your independence thing, right? So how comfortable are you being differentiated, being dependent, leaving your significant other for a while, having them leave you, knowing everything's going to be okay? How comfortable you are with being broken up with. If somebody says like, hey, our relationship's just not working out, are you like, yeah, that's disappointing and life just sucks? Or do you go nuclear and make it mean like how you're a terrible person? Okay, so that's your anxiety of abandonment or your ability, your kind of like independence, right, realm. Then on the other axis is your proximity seeking. So this is how much you desire close relationships. So this is related to your warmth dimension. How much do you want to be around other people? How much warmth do you feel? How much interpersonal feelings of positive like comfort do you feel when you're around other people? Okay, that's high proximity seeking. All right, so if you're high proximity seeking, you have a strong sense of warmth, you like to be around other people, and you have low anxiety of abandonment, right? You think people are safe, they're going to be there for you. If something goes bad in a relationship, it's not you, it's just shit happens, then you are known as a secure attachment style. So the figure I use for this, I don't really watch Charlie Brown at all, but I found this little square online and I always really liked it. So Peppermint Patty from Charlie Brown is kind of displayed as a secure attachment style because, you know, they're open with their feelings. They're not afraid to be around people. They're also fine speaking their mind, and controversy doesn't bother them because they know that if someone doesn't like their ideas or disagrees with them, it isn't something about their self-worth. It's just how life works. So low anxiety of abandonment, high proximity seeking is secure attachment style. Then on the opposite side, if you have low proximity seeking, so you don't want to be in a relationship, and you have high anxiety of abandonment because you're constantly convinced that people are going to abandon you and leave you and not take care of your feelings, you have a fearful attachment style, and that's Charlie Brown, right? Which makes sense. He's kind of like constantly afraid of being in relationships. He kind of keeps himself at a distance from people, and he also worries a lot about whether people are like bad, right? So secure, fearful. Those are your two opposites. Then I would say most people are not these two. So I'm sure that there's a couple of people somewhere in the world with a secure attachment style. I don't think there are that many of them. And then I would say some people probably legitimately have a fearful attachment style, but I think that's also kind of like, these are the extremes. But in the other corners, we have what I consider to be the more frequent ones. So if you're high proximity seeking, so you want a relationship, you want to be with other people, you enjoy it, you like those things make you feel good, but you also have high anxiety of abandonment, you're known as a preoccupied attachment style. Because you want a relationship, but you spend the whole time in the relationship thinking about how this isn't going to work and they don't really love you and oh my God, it's going to fall apart. So for me, this is like the person, like you've been on like 5 dates or whatever and you're sitting on the couch and you're watching Netflix and everything seems to be going pretty well and you're just like hanging out and enjoying and you like lay down on the couch together and they got their head on your arm or whatever and you ask, are you comfortable? Right? In kind of a general, like, is your head comfortable on my arm? Because we're just, like, getting to know each other and I'm still making sure that like, I know your preferences. And you're like, well, I'd just be a lot more comfortable if I knew where this was going. And it's like, oh, well, so you've been sitting here this whole time on the couch with me while I'm thinking everything's fine. And all you've been doing in your head is thinking about how you want me to define the relationship. So you haven't really been here with me. You've been over there thinking about how you want me to do something that I'm not doing. And this is the irony of the preoccupied attachment style because you think other people need to confirm to you that you're safe, but you're the person who needs to decide if the relationship is safe for you. And of course, you think that by them not being more willing to commit to you, they're not present in the relationship. But you sitting around just expecting everyone to commit to you is also you not being present in the relationship. Because I don't ever know if you're really with me as a relational partner or if you just want someone to guarantee that they're going to be around forever. And I frankly don't have that guarantee to make. So the preoccupied attachment style is one that probably got a lot of warmth as a child, a lot of affection, very comfortable with that, you know, kind of free of physical behaviors. But it could also not be. It could also be somebody who seeks out relationships as kind of a compensation for the fact that as a child they didn't get a lot of warmth or maybe they had some physically hurtful behaviors. But as they're seeking out those relationships, they're spending the whole time trying to get the other person to make them feel better because they have very, very low sense of independence. Right? They don't have a strong sense of differentiation. They only know who they are in the context of being someone else's partner or being someone else's friend or giving advice or solving problems. They don't have a lot of self hanging around when those things aren't happening. So that is Lucy Van Pelt. She's the character from Charlie Brown that I think is in love with Charlie Brown. But like I said, I don't really watch the show, so I just like this graphic. Okay. Then on the other side of preoccupied, we have the opposite, which is someone who's actually very low anxiety of abandonment. You know, thinks generally speaking that people are not going to, high sense of differentiation, high sense of like independence, like not needing to be around other people, having a lot of their own things going on, and low proximity seeking, meaning they're not looking for a relationship. And I like this image because the person they choose for this is Schroeder. And Schroeder is the character in Charlie Brown who always plays the piano. And so in the little example, he's the only one doing something. So Schroeder's down there in the little square playing the piano. Because to me, that's a really great dismissive attachment style is somebody who isn't afraid of other people. They just choose not to be in relationships because they have other stuff going on. So let's talk a little bit about this dismissive attachment style because I think it's kind of misunderstood. So, like, there's always this question, is the dismissive attachment style sort of a secure dismissive that knows that they could have a successful relationship but, like, just doesn't want it, kind of what we call true independence? Or is it more of a fearful dismissive that pushes people away so they can't get close or can't hurt them, which is what we call more like defensive independence. And if you look at where the square is for Schroeder's character, he's next to Peppermint Patty and he's next to Charlie Brown. So the question is, does Schroeder's dismissiveness fall more toward fearful because he's doing it as a defense mechanism, or more toward secure, which is, yeah, he's Schroeder's fine, like he's not worried about having a relationship. It's just he doesn't want to do it right now because frankly, like it's a lot of work. The original theory of this sort of always assumes that there's something wrong with dismissive people because why would you not seek out close relationships? Like, why would you not try to foster relationships? And for me, the theory doesn't really allow that you could potentially be a secure dismissive And that sucks because there's like nothing wrong with just deciding that, yeah, I could have a relationship. I'm fine with that, but meh, it's just like not what I want right now. You're not afraid of it. You just don't want to be bothered because like people are a lot of work and you maybe have other stuff going on. So to me, a dismissive attachment style could be dismissive in like the fearful dismissive, or we could just call it an occupied attachment style, because unlike preoccupied attachment style where you pursue a relationship but you're never present the whole time because you're always anxious about it, you're on the opposite side, which is you're not anxious about having a relationship, you're just choosing not to pursue it. And like especially if we think about more and more people being born on the autism spectrum and sort of different emotional availability cues, dismissive isn't necessarily a sign that they're less than secure, right? Secure isn't the ideal, and then the other three are the bad ones. Secure is just one of four types. And yes, I don't know that you want to go through life with a preoccupied or fearful attachment style, but I don't think there's anything wrong with having a dismissive attachment style, assuming that the dismissiveness comes from a preference, having a strong sense of attachment and strong independence, but just not necessarily wanting to do it right now. But unfortunately, for a lot of us, the dismissive is more often like a defensive dismissive. Like you really crave a relationship deep down inside, but then you're like, I'm not going to even bother because they're going to leave me. It's not going to work out. People are too much work. I'm better. And sometimes too, it's just like, I'm better than them. They don't live up to my standards. I would find a relationship if somebody could just meet my standards. That's also a kind of fearful, dismissive style. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the dismissive attachment style because that one to me is kind of funky and it doesn't quite fit into the 4-square model. But that's the problem with these 4-square models is they take like complex human behavior and boil them down into these like very basic squares, which is good. It's good for you as a learner. It's just sort of frustrating because it doesn't always maybe match up exactly with life. Okay, last thing. We're almost done. So one of the things that happens as a result of these two dimensions, right, your warmth dimension or your proximity-seeking dimension and your independence dimension or your sort of like anxiety of abandonment, is that you come up with different types of trust in a relationship. And I think this is super important because for a lot of us, we don't recognize that there are two different types of trust. And we wind up mistaking one kind of trust for another, and that gets us into trouble with relationships. So, trust is generally this idea that you are going to be able to take some risk or some kind of like divulge some kind of intimacy, whether it's asking someone to take care of your goldfish or telling someone a secret. You're going to be vulnerable with them, and they are not going to betray you. Right? That's essentially what trust means. However, there are two types of trust. There's what we call effective with an E, effective or cognitive trust, right? Sort of brain trust. I don't really like cognitive because cognitive can also be emotions. So I call it effective trust with an E. And then there's affective trust, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, which is another word for emotional trust. So I don't like the emotion reason binary, so I'm going to call it effective trust with an E and affective trust with an A. Effective trust is based on our knowledge and evidence about those we choose to trust. It's being able to trust people with sort of like task-based or objective things. So I trust you to check on my cats while I'm away, right? That's an effective move. You have to accomplish something. I trust that if we study for the test, you're going to know the right answers. Is another kind of effective trust, all right? I trust that I pay this money to go to Geneseo, or I use the taxpayer scholarship to go to Geneseo, and that when I have a professor who's standing in front of me, they're going to be able to teach me the things that I need to know to go get a job. That's effective trust. Now, lots of people can grow up in households with high effective trust or be in relationships with high effective trust and not high affective trust. So affective trust is born out of our emotional ties with others, including the security and the confidence we place in others based on the feelings that we generate. So, examples of affective trust: being able to tell you a secret, being able to have you come for me after a hard day, being someone that I can sort of divulge a vulnerability to or share a weakness or an inadequacy, and you're going to still understand and be around for me. Now, some of us grew up in environments with high affective trust and low effective trust. Some of us had both and some of us had neither. And now in our current relationships with friends or roommates, living situation, adult family, whatever, we may have both, we may have one, we may have neither. I think the thing that a lot of us run into as people with attachment styles that are trying to have relationships and attach to other people is that we often mistake one for the other. So just because I have a brother, for example, who is amazing with affective trust, he always knows the right thing to say. He listens to me, but he's got no effective trust. Like, I can't expect him to pay back loans. I can't expect him to follow through on expectations. So the problem is I can't let my affective trust of my brother become effective trust, or I'm going to get burned. So I have to know what are the right things to trust him with and what are not. On the other hand, I have people whom I affectively trust with my feelings and on the other hand, I have people that I effectively trust to have knowledge that I need, to train me to do things, to answer questions, to be able to give me guidance on certain questions, but I don't trust them affectively to take care of my feelings. So I'm not going to go to that person when what I need is affective care. So this is understanding the difference between sort of like the warmth feelings dimension of a relationship and the practical know-how of the relationship. And if you go to a person with whom you have high cognitive trust or effective trust, expecting affective trust, and you don't get it, you're going to think that that's a failure of them or that's a reflection of you, and you're going to be very disappointed. But what you need to recognize is that you ask someone who could not provide you with affective trust to do that because you thought trust was all the same kind of trust. And this is a big mistake we make in our relationships. So, for example, with my father, I don't have a lot of affective trust in that dude. Like, I do not, if I have a bad day, he is not the person that I want to go to with bad news because he's immediately going to make it about him. If I have good news, I don't want to go to him because he's immediately going to make it about that. If I'm sad, if I'm upset, if I'm having trouble, if I'm having difficulty, if I'm in distress, I don't go to him because he's immediately going to say exactly what I don't want to hear because it's going to be all about him and not about me. And I grew up very angry that I did not have a father that I could affectively trust. However, I can't effectively trust him. He knows a lot of stuff. He's a good problem solver. If I get in trouble, typically he's there to bail me out. Granted, I don't get in trouble a lot, but, if I needed somebody to bail me out of jail tomorrow, he'd come and bail me out of jail. He wouldn't be affectively good about it, but he would be effective about it. If I needed somebody to come up and watch my apartment for a week while I was gone, or if I needed somebody to help try to figure out what I'm going to do about a car breaking down, he's the guy. But my whole life, I was angry at him for not being an affectively trustworthy person. And I didn't recognize that he was, in many ways, effectively trustworthy. Now, he wasn't always effectively trustworthy because, as an addict, you can only be so effectively trustworthy. But I've let go of that because I now realize that not everyone's going to have affective and effective trustworthiness. So you have to recognize which kinds of trust people have. If they have none, then that's fine. I mean, you probably should get rid of those people. But maybe if they only have one, that's okay, and you can be grateful for that one. Don't go to them for the other kind, though. So there's a phrase in the Al-Anon program, which is the sister program to Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. It says, don't go to the hardware store for bread, right? If you need bread, go to the store that sells bread. If you need tools, go to the hardware store. Don't go to the hardware store for bread. And that's the same thing. Don't go to an affectively trustworthy person for effective trust.